God's word to us this morning. When John heard in prison what the Messiah was doing, he sent word by his disciples and said to him, "Are you the one who is to come, or are we to wait for another?" Jesus answered them, "Go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the poor have good news brought to them. And blessed is anyone who takes no offense at me." As they went away, Jesus began to speak to the crowds about John. "What did you go out into the wilderness to look at? A reed shaken by the wind? What then did you go out to see? Someone dressed in soft robes? Look, those who wear soft robes are in royal palaces. What then did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, I tell you, and more than a prophet, this is the one about whom it is written, 'See, I am sending my messenger ahead of you, who will prepare your way before you.' Truly I tell you, among those born of women, no one has arisen greater than John the Baptist. Yet the least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he." This too is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Our sense of smell, scientists tell us, was one of the first senses to develop, evolutionarily speaking. Though we tend to think of ourselves as not having as good of sniffers as, say, our canine companions, smell is still a powerful sense in humans. One recent study found that we have 40 million neuron receptors in our brains linked to smell, and that these neurons can help us distinguish between at least 1 trillion different odors, though we don't have the vocabulary to describe all of them. An article in Discovery magazine says that although our noses can sometimes lead us astray, in general they send us important messages about other people. Be careful. A dangerous person was here and may be lurking nearby. Be cautious. A person is sick and may be contagious. Be alert. Your newborn needs care. Be flirtatious. This person is a potential partner. Because our sense of smell is linked to keeping us alert to the world and people around us, it is also particularly linked to emotion and memory, maybe even more so than our other senses. Think about how a particular perfume smell can remind you of someone, maybe even someone who is long gone. Or the smell of a campfire can pull you into a particular memory. Or the smell of a certain dish being prepared, or the smell of a baby. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus comes on the scene, linking our emotion and understanding of who God is to the smell of a baby. And though we don't have the smells of the stable like we do in Luke's Gospel, both Gospels proclaim that God with us has a distinctly human smell. At the beginning of the Gospel of John, on the other hand, Jesus smells like cosmic light. We're going to read that passage on Tuesday evening. I don't know what cosmic light smells like. But in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus enters scene 1 smelling like a full-grown man recently baptized in the Jordan River by John the Baptist. Now, in worship a few weeks ago, we met John the Baptist. I think I see him sitting in the back over there. We met John the Baptist. And we know that he probably smelled unique. With a diet of locusts, I'm not making fun of you, with a diet of locusts and wild honey, wearing clothing made of camel's hair, living out in the desert, out in the wilderness. We're told by all the gospel writers that Jesus came out to John in the wilderness to be baptized, and that John recognized him as the powerful one he was getting everyone ready for. All his work, all his preparations. John's prayer as he saw and baptized Jesus must have been similar to fresh from God, refresh our spirits. The smell that John hoped to smell as Jesus came near and began his ministry was the smell of victory. John tells the people who came to the Jordan about the Messiah who was to come, his winnowing fork is in his hand, and he will clear his threshing floor, and he'll gather his wheat to the granary, but the chaff he will burn with unquenchable fire. The Messiah was to come and to set things right, to bring justice, to separate the righteous from the unrighteous, to bring the kingdom of God here and now, a kingdom that would kick out Israel's enemies and bring down the rulers that had collaborated with their enemies. Jesus was to smell like the royal robes he speaks about to the crowds. John hoped that Jesus' arrival ushered in the smell of victory. But in our reading today, I just read, which is an actual Advent reading in our lectionary, by the way, we find that John's nose is filled with other smells. The smell of prison, the smells of disappointment, despair, doubt, the smell of suffering. John finds himself in prison on account of speaking truth to power. And while he's waiting and suffering in prison, he begins to wonder if his neurons had led him astray about who Jesus was. If what he had sensed was wrong. He sends word to Jesus and asks, "Are you the one who is to come? Or should we wait for another?" And reading between the lines, we might hear John asking, "My life is on the line, Jesus. Do you even care?" John's journey from certitude to doubt perhaps is one of the truest stories we can hear this Christmas. It's a story that reflects our own disappointments at times with God, who doesn't seem to show up in the ways or times we want our God to. Disappointment with our world, which seems so broken in overwhelming ways. Disappointment with our families, who are supposed to be safe spaces and people who love us without exception, but who so often fail. Disappointment with ourselves, when our own instincts about people and situations lead us seemingly astray. If we're honest with ourselves, this story of doubt and disappointment is also the story of Christmas. It's why this season can be so gosh darn hard. We know that things are not going to be turned right on Christmas Eve. Our lives are not going to be tied up neatly like the ending of a Hallmark movie. We Christians often try to make God okay and have a hard time sitting in the presence of doubt and despair. Debbie Thomas writes that this story about John is not okay. And many of our own stories aren't okay either. The prison bars that hold us don't always give way. Our doubts don't always resolve themselves. Justice doesn't always arrive in time. Questions don't always receive the answers we hunger for. But today we baptize Hudson and pray for him and ask God's blessing on him. And we do all this knowing that life will not always be okay for him. That life always won't smell fresh or like victory for him. But in this act of baptism, we are also reminded of God's grace already at work in his life. This hope and knowledge that God won't abandon him when things are not okay. That promise is for us too. Though Jesus isn't physically with John in prison, and even though John's doubts about Jesus come through loud and clear with his questions, Jesus doesn't abandon his friend. And he doesn't shoot back with, "Yes, of course I'm the one you idiot." No, Jesus invites John to rewire his neurons, to open up his senses, to reimagine what the kingdom of God smells like, looks like, sounds like, feels like. Go and tell John what you've experienced, Jesus says. Blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear. Dead are raised, and the poor have good news brought to them. You, John, are in prison, but God indeed is breaking into the world. Your story in this moment is not the whole sum of who God is, but only a part of it. Rewire your neurons to smell and experience God in prison cells, in hospital rooms, in nursing homes, and even in the halls and rooms of First Church during Warming Center Week. Learn to trust that while God is with you at your not okayest, God is also at work in the world. And God is at work fulfilling our hopes and banishing our fears. God's work is not yet complete in our world, but it will be. There will be a day that it will be. Now, we don't know what John's response to Jesus' reply was. Matthew doesn't tell us. We don't know if Jesus' words were enough for him, if they brought him comfort or even joy while in prison. Perhaps, like for us, on some days, they were enough. Perhaps, like for us, on some days, John was able to hitch whatever hope he was able to muster on the trust that while things smelled downright terrible for him in his situation, that God was there with him. God was at work in the world through Jesus. And that God was even already at the end, ushering in the smells of victory over disappointment, despair, and even death. So if this Christmas smells less than sweet to you, know you are in good company, even in the company of John the Baptist himself. But perhaps, too, in the midst of it, you might hear Jesus' invitation as well to open your senses and imagination to where and how else God might be showing up in the world, and even in your own life. Though our noses might sometimes lead us astray, we can trust that Jesus won't. To God be the glory.